Today we have discussed about theory of perfectly competitive labor market. A perfectly competitive labor market has following characteristics. A large number of firms competing to hire a specific type of labor, numerous people with homogeneous skills who independently supply their labor services, wage-taking behavior, perfect costless information and labor mobility. അതായത് ഒരു പെർഫെക്റ്റ് കോമ്പറ്റീറ്റീവ് ലേബർ മാർക്കറ്റ് ഫോളോ ചെയ്യുന്ന ക്യാരക്ടറിസ്റ്റിക്സ് ആണ് ആദ്യത്തെ 4 പോയിന്റ്സ്. ഫസ്റ്റ് പറഞ്ഞു ലാർജ് നമ്പർ ഓഫ് ഫേംസ് കോമ്പറ്റിംഗ് ടു ഹയർ എ സ്പെസിഫിക് ടൈപ്പ് ഓഫ് ലേബർ. Second, a numerous people with a homogeneous skill who independently supply their labor service. They independently supply their labor power. Third one is wage-taking behavior. They take wages. That is the behavior of a perfect competitive labor market employers. Then fourth one, a perfect costless information and labor mobility. These are the 4 characteristics of a perfectly competitive labor market. Then the labor market. The market for labor can be divided into 2 components. The market for labor can be divided into 2 components. First one is labor demand and labor supply. What is labor demand? Labor demand is the action and desire of firms for workers. Labor demand is the actions and desires of firms for workers. Then labor supply. Labor supply deriving from decision of the workers. Labor supply is derived from the decision of the worker. Worker will decide to supply, to what extent they ready to supply their labor power. Okay, what are the 2 components? Labor demand and labor supply. Labor demand means the action and desire of the firm. How much labor should be hired. How much labor should be hired for their firm or for their industry. Labor supply means it is derived from decision of the worker. The worker decide how much their labor power they are ready to extend or they are ready to supply their labor power. Then individual labor supply curves are backward bending. You always know about the individual labor supply curves are backward bending curve. Does this imply that market labor supply curve are also backward bending? No, because market labor supply curves are determined more by the number of individuals that choose to supply their labor to that market than the number of hours each supplies. Individual labor supply curve are backward bending, but the market labor supply curves are not backward bending. Due to the reason is that it is determined more by a number of individuals. Market supply curve is market labor supply curve is determined by a number of individuals that choose to supply their labor to the market than the number of hours each supplies. Supply their labor to that market than the number of hours each supplies. So at a higher wage rate relative to other markets, more people choose to supply labor to that particular market and the curve is always upward sloping. The shape of the market labor supply curve is always upward sloping. The reason is that the higher wage rate relative to other market, more people ready to supply their labor to that particular market. Higher wage rate relative to other market, people ready to supply their labor to a particular market. So the curve is always up sloping or upward sloping. In perfectly competitive labor and product market, labor supply curve measures the marginal opportunity cost. In labor and product market, labor supply curve, perfectly competitive labor and product market, labor supply curve measure what cost? Marginal opportunity cost. Write down the point. Labor supply curve measure the marginal opportunity cost. One final point, the shorter the time period and more specialized the type of labor, less elastic the labor supply curve. Shorter the time period and more specialized type of labor, less elastic the labor supply curve. What is the shape of labor supply curve? Less elastic, in which case there is a time period is very short and the labors are more specialized. In such a case, a labor supply curve is less elastic. Okay, next one is the diagram of labor supply, individual labor supply and market labor supply. Individual labor supply curve is, we always seen that is a backward bending, and market labor supply curve is upward sloping. In the last paragraph we discussed about that. The diagram is shown the same. Individual labor supply curve is backward bending and market labor supply curve is upward sloping. Individual labor supply curve is denoted as SA, SB, SC, SD. These are here the four individual labor supply curves we consider. In the x-axis we denoted as labor, and y-axis denoted as wage, W1, W2 and W3. In the same, in the x-axis labor curve and y-axis is a wage curve. The market labor supply is supply of labor is upward sloping. Then equilibrium. Equilibrium occurs in labor market the same way it does in product market. Equilibrium in labor market is same as in the case of goods market. If the quantity supplied does not equal the quantity demand, someone, a labor buyer or seller, will be unable to realize their desire and the wage will be bid up or down by this frustrated labor market participant. Equilibrium occurs in the labor market the same way as in the product market. If the quantity supply does not equal the quantity demand. In goods market we says that quantity demand and quantity supply both are intersecting each other will determine the price, equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. As in the case of labor market, here the quantity of labor and wage, supply of labor and demand for labor, it is representing in the next diagram. Determinants of equilibrium. Labor supply and demand curve are drawn assuming ceteris paribus. Labor supply and demand curve, supply curve and demand curve are drawn assuming ceteris paribus. But of course not all factors other than wage are really constant. Not all factors. All factors constant alla. Not all factors other than wage are really constant. What are some of these other factors that can determine the quantity of labor demand and supplied? എന്തൊക്കെയാണ് മറ്റുള്ള factors? What are the other factors determining quantity of labor demand and labor supply? Determinants of labor supply. What are the factors determining labor supply? Other wage rates, then non-wage income, preferences for work versus leisure, non-wage aspects of the job, number of qualified suppliers. What are the determinants of labor supply? Other wage rate, non-wage income, preference for work versus leisure, non-wage aspects of job, number of qualified suppliers. Then what are the determinants of labor demand? Product demand, productivity, prices of other resources, number of employers. These are the determinants of labor demand. Labor demand and supply are drawn assuming ceteris paribus, but of course not all factors. എല്ലാ ഫാക്ടേഴ്സും കോൺസ്റ്റന്റ് അല്ല. ദാൻ വേജസ് ആർ റിയലി കോൺസ്റ്റന്റ്. അപ്പോൾ വേജ് കോൺസ്റ്റന്റ് ആയിട്ട് നമ്മൾ വെക്കും. ബാക്കിയുള്ള ഫാക്ടേഴ്സിനെ ഡിപ്പെൻഡ് ചെയ്തിട്ടാണ് ലേബർ ഡിമാൻഡ് ആൻഡ് ലേബർ സപ്ലൈ. വാട്ട് ആർ ദ ഡിറ്റർമിനൻസ് ഓഫ് ലേബർ സപ്ലൈ? This 5 determinants: other wage rate, non-wage income, preference for work versus leisure, non-wage aspects of job, number of qualified suppliers. Then what are the determinants of labor demand? Product demand, productivity, price of other resources, number of employers. The distinction between change in demand and change in quantity demand. Change in demand and change in supply. Quantity demand or quantity supply is also important in labor market. As in the same case of product market, labor market, the case of change in demand and change in supply is also important. A change in wage rate will cause a movement along a curve. A change in wage rate will cause a movement along the curve, but a change in one of the above listed determinant will shift the curve itself. അപ്പോൾ വേജ് റേറ്റിൽ വരുന്ന ചേഞ്ച് ഒരു ഡിമാൻഡ് കർവിൽ തന്നെ സെയിം കർവിൽ തന്നെ ഒരു മൂവ്മെൻറ്റ് ക്രിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. ചേഞ്ച് ഇൻ വൺ ഓഫ് ദ എബവ് ലിസ്റ്റഡ് ഡിറ്റർമിനൻറ്റ്സ്, വി ഹാവ് സം അതർ ഡിറ്റർമിനൻറ്റ്സ് ഡിറ്റർമിനിങ് ലേബർ ഡിമാൻഡ് ആൻഡ് ലേബർ സപ്ലൈ. Is any change in these determinants, any one of these determinants will shift the curve. Okay, clear? A change in wage rate will cause a movement along the determinant, movement along the curve. A change in the wage rate. Wage rate is constant. A change in wage rate will cause a movement along the demand curve or movement along the supply curve. But the change in any one of the determinant will cause a shift in the demand or supply curve. To demonstrate how a competitive market works, suppose that a labor market experiences a decline in the demand for the product produced by firms hiring labor in this market, reducing the price of the product and thus marginal revenue product of labor. Suppose that a competitive labor market experience a decline in demand for the product. Decline in demand due to increase in price. The labor market hired more labor, automatically the price of the commodity, the price of the product is increase simultaneously. It depends on the marginal revenue product of labor. Here we discussed the above matter with a diagram. As demand curve, D naught is the original demand curve, original demand for labor, and S naught is the original supply of labor. Demand for labor, D naught, is the backward shifting demand curve. Demand for labor is to be declining, and the supply of labor is original one is S naught, then S1 is the increasing rightward shift of the supply curve is shown as S1. The original wage rate is W naught, original wage, the quantity of labor is Q naught, then wage rate decline, the quantity of labor decline, the wage rate is also decline. It's a shift of demand for labor and supply of labor shown in this diagram. ഈ ഒരു വീഡിയോയിൽ പെർഫെക്റ്റ് കോമ്പറ്റിറ്റീവ് ലേബർ മാർക്കറ്റ് എന്താണെന്നും അതിലുള്ള ഡിറ്റർമിനൻറ്റ്സ്, വാട്ട് ആർ ദ ഡിറ്റർമിനൻറ്റ്സ് ഡിറ്റർമിനിങ് ദ ലേബർ സപ്ലൈ ആൻഡ് ലേബർ ഡിമാൻഡ്, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ അതിൻ്റെ ഇക്വിലിബ്രിയം കണ്ടീഷൻ, ഇൻഡിവിജ്വൽ ലേബർ മാർക്കറ്റും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ മാർക്കറ്റ് ലേബർ മാർക്കറ്റിൻ്റെ ഇൻഡിവിജ്വൽ കേസും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഒരു മാർക്കറ്റിൻ്റെ ലേബർ ഡിമാൻഡ് ആൻഡ് സപ്ലൈ കർവും ക്ലിയർ ആയി കാണുമെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കുന്നു. ഓക്കെ, താങ്ക് യു.